Verses of Reddit, what's your worst work-related story? I have a few that aren't the worst out there, but they're still good times. A schizophrenic homeless man told me how he had to smoke all of the chicken nuggets before the chicken nugget mamas could, so that he can save the chicken nugget mamas' babies. Not all heroes wear capes. Then there was the old man that would poop himself, dig his fingers in his butt, then proceed to put his poopy fingers in his mouth and up his nose. Lastly, was the obese woman that had horrible lymphedema, which made it hard for her to walk, so instead of getting up to the bathroom or commode, she would ask for a towel to stuff between her legs and pee all over herself. The smell of that woman's inner legs cannot be described with words. So many to choose from. I'm gonna go with the homeless guy that came to our hospital with an abdominal abscess, basically a hole in his abdomen. We were trying to clean his wound and assess the damage, and when we reached inside his wound, we started finding money. He nonchalantly stated that he kept his money tucked in there, to protect it from being stolen. Won't share the most common one, as it could very easily be used to identify me and the patients. But I've seen some nasty stuff. My first night shift, I had a guy pee on my face and shoulder. He almost got it on my mouth and lips, but I saw it coming and turned. He was confused, unsteady, and he climbed out of bed actively urinating all over the floor. I grabbed a urinal and held him up and got him pointed in the urinal. Everything is going great until he reaches down and grabs it, pointing it up and out of the urinal, directly at my face. I've seen a cancerous breast tumor that was larger than a softball. Lady was aware of the lump but didn't believe in modern medicine. She was choosing to treat it with herbs and supplements. Eventually the tumor grew so large that it was attached to her ribs and could not be operated on. She eventually came into the hospital when she started to bleed to death, as the tumor had split open. Patient would get a blood transfusion about once a month. The wound smelled like week-old roadkill, and you could smell it all the way down the hallway. While reinforcing her wound dressings one night, we unwrapped an ace bandage that was holding an abdominal pad in place to catch the drainage that was soaking through the primary wound dressing. When we pulled the ace bandage and abdominal pad off, a fly came flying out of the wound dressing. Both myself and the nurse saw it, and the nurse let out an eekk. Patient asked, "What happened?" Fellow nurse is barely holding it together, and I tell the patient, a fly came out of the dressing. Patient replies, "Oh yeah, that happens sometimes. Medical maggots are used to clean wounds, but medical maggots cannot become actual flies. They try to pupate from larva to fly, but have been modified to prevent them from being able to." This was definitely not a medical maggot, because we never used them on her wound, as it was not a candidate for maggot therapy. Lady was not homeless and would be considered middle class. I've seen a rotten diabetic foot wound that was black. It smelled like roadkill and encompassed the patient's entire big toe. The underside of the toe had a massive open spot with thick pus. It looked like I could have irrigated it and the bones would have been visible. All toes and half of the foot were amputated. I had a patient with an open fasciotomy wound that ran from hip to knee that had a wound vac connected to the wound. This is basically a wound dressing that creates a seal with a small tube running to small vacuum device. Wound vacs apply negative pressure to the wound and also drain anything coming out of the wound. The wound had developed MRSA, which is one of the worst bacterial infections you can develop. Well, Mr. Wound Vac patient kept having issues with his wound vac and it would lose its seal. I came into the room one evening to discover the patient had disconnected the tubing of the wound vac and was sucking on the end of the tubing that ran out of the wound. The line had pinkish yellow MRSA drainage that was coming out of the tube. I was so shocked I didn't even know what to say other than, don't do that. I then had to explain to him why. I passed this along to the next shift. That patient disconnected the wound vac tubing and was sucking the MRSA wound drainage from the tube. The nurse exclaimed, "I saw him do that too." I tried telling him not to mess with it. I've seen mentally unstable patients smear poop all over themselves and the bed. I've had mentally stable patients smear poop all over the walls and floor of the bathroom because they were mad at the nursing staff. Only problem was that she was mad at the staff from the previous shift, who was now at home sleeping while I got to clean the patient and bathroom up. I took care of a patient that was morbidly obese and could not walk due to her weight. When she was first brought in, it was reported that the rotting remnants of a half-eaten ham and cheese sandwich was found in one of her fat folds. I could play this game all night. Seriously, I have witnessed so many different things like these. But the last one was one of the worst. The patient had developed a fistula between his intestine and his bladder, causing stool to leak into his bladder. The patient reported that this started the previous day. It was confirmed with a urine sample. Thinking that the patient may have accidentally given a urine and stool sample in the same container, a catheter was inserted and the flow coming out was confirmed as stool and urine. The patient was quickly transferred to a specialty surgeon. Hospice nurse here. My assignment was a 13-hour shift with a 10-year-old patient suffering from brain cancer, one-on-one care in his home. He was unresponsive but still breathing when I arrived. Basically he was gone, but his body hadn't figured that out yet. Tiny little guy in a big hospital bed, his mom lying in the bed beside him. His dad was on his other side holding his hand. Grandparents were in the adjoining living room with the patient's 6-year-old sister. Getting through that shift took all the mental and emotional strength I had. He died a few hours after my shift ended. I will gladly deal with blood, vomit, pus, poop, whatever rather than go through something like that ever again. A man was discharged from a mental health facility a few days prior. He went home and built a pizza in his garage out of pipes. He proceeded to boom himself in the chest. His wife called EMS. He was talking when he came into the He asked for water because he was thirsty. This is usually the first sign someone isn't going to make it. The CT scan showed there was a bullet in the heart. He was rushed into my OR. The surgeon split the ribs and was feeling around for where the bullet went. Meanwhile, the front desk is trying to get a hold of the cardiovascular surgeon on call. He's out of town and says to call one of his partners. The first partner is also out of town, the second and third are both an hour away at other hospitals. The surgeon finds a hole in the left ventricle. I am able to get a hold of another surgeon who isn't on call but is 20 minutes away. He says the patient needs to get on bypass if there's any chance, but he'll probably end up dying anyway. Anesthesia is on a massive transfusion protocol, but his vitals are not improving. The surgeon opens the pericardium and it sounds like a water balloon hitting the pavement. In an instant, a liter of crimson-colored blood pours out of the drapes and onto the floor. Anesthesia calls out there's no pulse. Another liter and a half pour from the drapes. We now know where all the blood went. The next 2 hours include filling out paperwork and calling the medical examiner. I have to speak to the widow and his mother about signing the forms for the ME. His death will have to be investigated by the county. I still have to get the meat wagon from the morgue and put him on ice. My shift ended 3 hours prior, but it's my death in my OR, so I'm responsible for all the details and paperwork. This one isn't as emotionally tough as the 12-year-old who crashed a side-by-side on a co-worker's property. He was declared brain dead the next morning. The staff lined the halls for an honor walk as his bed rolled by to the OR for an organ procurement. As the father of 2 young boys myself, I broke down and cried as the mother said goodbye. She adjusted his blanket to keep him warm and kept telling him, "It'll be okay. I'll see you later. It'll be okay." We had a guy come into the ER from a nursing home. According to report, he asked the staff for a glass of water. When he didn't receive it quickly enough, his rational response was to start eating his fingers. By the time he got to us, he had eaten all 10 of his fingertips away. Bone was definitely visible. There was still flesh stuck in his teeth and on his sheets. That's a sight I won't forget anytime soon. You've reached a checkpoint. Reddit/I bleach taker. Few moment for a break. Had a nice older gentleman patient who was tachycardic, but all his labs were normal. He seemed like he took fairly good care of himself, was a little disheveled, but he dressed nice and had nice shoes. We initially couldn't find anything wrong with him, but he had a peculiar odor to him that seasoned nurses would get suspicious of. I asked him if he had any infections on his body that he knew of, and he said, "No, but I wanted to do a thorough check," so we took off all his clothes, and he was fine, until I got down to his feet. He was wearing an old pair of socks, and as I peeled them down, literally the skin around his foot came off with the sock. I was essentially degloving his foot. It was so vile, I couldn't even get down more than a couple inches. It was raw flesh under those socks. The wound odor was so strong, I knew then that his feet were the source. He probably hadn't changed his socks in several months. He ended up being admitted and given lots of antibiotics and wound care. The memory of pulling down his socks will haunt me forever. Ha 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 he 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 ha. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to Reddit Said It. Or don't, I'm not your boss.